Work can be mundane, work can be boring, work can be monotonous. A lot of days are like cookie cutter, the same grind for the same goal. That is what February the 9th was like for the employees of the Passaic Valley Water Commission treatment facility and their senior engineer, a 43-year-old talented Indian American woman. Little did anyone know, though, that day would go down in the company's history as one when everything changed for the worse. Little did anyone know that was going to be a day of tragedy and death, with a murderer lurking in the shadows under plain sight. This is the story of that day, that office, and that woman. This is the story of Geetha Angara. Hi everyone, welcome to the Desi Crime Podcast, a show where we dive deep into some of the craziest cases from around South Asia. I'm your host Aishwarya.
And I'm Aryaan.
And the case that I have for you today is one that will leave you wondering what really happened. But before we get into this episode, there is something we need to talk to you guys about. Why do you pick your protein powder like you're picking people on dating apps? Always falling for the wrong type, ignoring all the red flags, and then crying and cribbing when things don't turn out the way you wanted them to. I was exactly like you, and I've made that mistake with my first protein powder. So I'm here to save you. Here are 3 biggest protein powder red flags. And if you see these in your protein powder, swipe left and click on the Whole Truth Foods link in our description instead. Use code Desi20 at checkout for 20% off the best powders that come in travel size sachets and also have a 1 kg option on their website. Red flag number 1. Your protein powder lasts 2 years. While this may give you instant heart eyes for your powder, this means chemical additives and preservatives are present in there. And that's what will cause you bloating, skin irritation, and constipation. In contrast, the Whole Truth powder lasts only as long as the natural shelf life of its ingredients. Red flag number 2, your protein powder does not foam. Okay, we all hate that lathery foam in our protein shakes, so I understand if you picked a powder that claims not to foam. But that means that your powder contains anti-foaming agents, which are all ultra-processed chemicals. The whole truth is that the purest form of whey should foam. It's a sign of high quality, just like the Whole Truth powder does. Red flag number 3, your protein powder tastes exactly like a strawberry milkshake. While perfect and really yummy flavors may make it easier for you to hit your protein goals, the truth is that they're achieved using artificial flavoring and added sugars. The Whole Truth powder has none of those and is sweetened using only monk fruit, which is a 0-calorie natural sweetener that also happens to be 150 times sweeter than refined sugar. With those red flags in mind, you're now ready to enter the protein powder dating market. Go find your perfect match on thewholetruthfoods.com and enter code Desi20 for 20% off your order. And now to begin this case, we're going back in time to February the 9th, 2005 to the Passaic Valley Water Commission treatment facility in New Jersey in the United States. That day was like any other in the past, cold and frigid in the New Jersey winter, but one where business was going about as usual at the facility, until some of the employees began to notice the untouched lunch kept on the table of 43-year-old Geetha Angara, a senior chemist at the facility. Born and raised in India, Geetha received her bachelor's and master's degree in chemistry in India as well after she moved to the US in 1984 with her husband and went on to receive a doctorate from NYU. After graduating from NYU, she received a prestigious job at the Water Commission located about 45 minutes from the home Geetha shared with her loving husband and 3 children. That morning of the 9th of February, Geetha had made that 45-minute drive to work, but her untouched lunch had not gone unnoticed by her friends and colleagues. You see, lunchtime had passed, and there was no reason for Geetha to have missed hers. In fact, called a woman of, quote, impeccable habit, she followed a very standard routine around lunchtime every day, where she would head to the water tanks in the facility, collect water samples from there as part of her job, and then head back to her desk to finish her lunch with her friends and co-workers. Today, however, hours after lunchtime, Geetha was nowhere to be seen and her lunch sat on her desk untouched. But even though lunchtime had passed, people had just seen Geetha at around 10:30 am that morning. She had shown up for work. Everyone was sure of that. And so in the hustle and grind of the regular workday, people just assumed Geetha got caught up with work at some other part of the facility, missed lunch, and would be back soon. And this wasn't a bad assumption to make. Geetha's job at the company involved less desk work and more movement across the facility, like collecting water samples from the tanks. And so just like that, Geetha was forgotten. Forgotten until 4 pm rolled around and Geetha's shift ended, but her lunch and bag sat in the same spot as all day, unmoved. Then 4 pm turned into 10 pm with alarm bells ringing for the workers who had later shifts and saw Geetha's lunch and bag still on her table and her car still in the parking lot.
Given it's a water facility, I'm guessing it's a 24/7 facility, right? Like there are people in and out at all times of the day.
Correct. And it was those people who were there late in the night that noticed this oddity, Geetha's car parked in the parking lot, and found this alarming. Back in Geetha's home in Homedale Township, New Jersey, her loving husband Geetha Angara and their 3 children were all beginning to panic too. Shortly after her shift got over at 4, Geetha was supposed to give her daughter Pavitra a ride to a basketball game but did not show up. When call after call to her from her daughter and husband went unanswered, the family thought she may have gotten caught up at work and would show up soon enough. Little did they know, Geetha's phone was buzzing on her work desk at the facility, right where it had been all day. As 10 pm rolled around when co-workers were finding Geetha's car in the parking lot, the Angara family knew something was very wrong. It was at that point, at around 11:20 pm, almost 13 hours since someone had last seen Geetha, that one of the Passaic employees dialed 911 and called the police. And when the police arrived at the treatment facility, the employees described something very eerie to the cops. You see, between when the cops were called and when they arrived, the employees decided to use their time and think back to the day and trace back Geetha's steps. They knew she arrived at work at around 8 am when she settled down at her desk and began doing some work till about 10. Then at around 10:10, she headed to the break room where she had a conversation with a technician from her lab who told her she needed to head to the basement for the water plant and calibrate the filters and sensors of the plant. At around 10:30 am, after this conversation, Geetha returned to her desk, grabbed her clipboard, a two-way radio and a beaker and headed towards the basement of the plant for 2 things: to calibrate the sensors as she had been asked to do and to gather samples from the water tanks as she would regularly do. That was the last time any of the workers at Passaic remember seeing her. As they stand there in their office waiting for the police to arrive, they know they should go have a look at the basement and the water tanks. And so this group goes. And when they arrive at the water tanks, while there is still no sign of Geetha, a bunch of small details just gives everyone a pit in their stomachs. What they're seeing in front of them are 2 gigantic water tanks, 40 feet by 100 feet in dimensions and 35 feet deep inside. For reference, 35 feet is pretty much the length of one of those really large public transport buses. That is how deep these water tanks were. And each tank was filled with 12 million tons of freezing 36-degree Fahrenheit water that was used to supply localities in New Jersey with water every day. The group of employees stood on a narrow bridge that ran on top of the 2 tanks, and when they looked down next to their feet, they saw pieces of broken glass everywhere, seemingly from a glass beaker. Mixed in with the shards of glass were many tiny broken screws, which were ordinarily used to keep the water tanks closed. The top of the water tanks were covered with metal grates to be held up by these screws, but with the screws lying on the floor, the grate covering the top of the tank was also off. Not fully off, but moved, creating a gap technically big enough for an adult to fall in, but not comfortably so. This sight, the broken glass and screws and open tank, is what the employees told the police about, and immediately the police knew where they needed to try and find Geetha. By midnight, the police have scoured the area around the tanks and noticed all the same oddities the co-workers did. And so they decide to call backup as well as divers to get into the millions of tons of water to try and find a body or any clues at all. And once the divers went in, there was not one clue inside the tank, there were 3. A sneaker identified as Geetha's, her clipboard and her walkie-talkie. While there was no body found by the divers, the water was so deep, there was a possibility she was still in there. And so the police closed off the tank with no water going out to the public from any of these tanks, diverted the water supply and decided to drain the tank to find the body.
So, Shweta, assuming that there is a body in there somewhere deep inside the tank for the last 10, 12 hours or how much ever time has passed,
Yep.
if there is truly a body in there, the water being consumed by the residents of New Jersey up until that point
Has
had
been contaminated.
by a dead body.
So I'll say I don't fully know what the mechanics are. Is the water in there at any given moment in time going out to people? Or from there, does it like possibly take some time? There are multiple different tanks working.
What's the process?
So I don't know what the process is.
You don't know. So do you know if the water inside the tankers has been treated? I'm guessing it has been treated, right? To some degree.
I'm sure to some degree, but to
that's not
still
the
have
final
water, right?
But still have a dead body in...
Absolutely. Going to the homes of 800,000 people
Yeah.
in a locality. So obviously they shut it all down.
Yeah, the side note there living in India is that we dispose dead bodies of in rivers anyway.
Absolutely.
But that's pre-treatment. But still, the psychological effect of that is a little jarring.
Yep. After hours of the 12 million gallons getting drained by around 6:30 p.m. the next evening, Geetha Angara's dead body is found inside the tank. But the moment divers pull her out of the tank, something immediately stands out to the inspectors on site. The bruises and seeming struggle marks on her from her neck to her face. For those whom this still felt like an accident, her bruises, added with the fact that the grate on top of the tank wasn't fully off, indicating Geetha had fallen in, after which someone had replaced the grate on the opening, was just proof that Geetha's death was a murder. Quote, there is no doubt in our minds that this is homicide. It would be difficult to remove the plate, accidentally fall in, and then put the plate back in place, said the county prosecutor James Avigliano. When Geetha's autopsy was conducted, her cause of death was determined by the coroner's office to be drowning due to the water found in her lungs, indicating she was breathing when she fell into the tank. No signs of sexual assault were detected, but her manner of death was determined to be homicide, again due to the seeming strangulation marks on her neck and scars on her elbow and waist. The county prosecutor said, quote, Angara was alive when forced into the tank. Her killer surprised her, and an autopsy showed she had been subdued. We hope she was unconscious when she hit the water though. If she was conscious, she would know there was no way out of this. It would just be a horrible way to die. End quote.
Ash, I'm not fully sure what this tank looks like, but say somebody was fully conscious when they were pushed in or accidentally fell in, right?
Right.
Is there any scope of floating or swimming or trying to stay afloat till somebody comes and helps you? Or is it just, is drowning an inevitability?
I don't know. I'm not fully sure. And as someone who doesn't know how to swim, I genuinely don't know the mechanics.
Yeah.
Right? I don't know the mechanics of what it's like to fall into water. I'm just guessing if you fall from a height that is, let's say, the bridge, right?
Yeah.
The force with which you've fallen in, you're automatically sinking to the bottom the moment you're there. So then the job is not to make sure you're floating. It's to first try and come up to the top to begin with. And that just seems like...
What was the height of the bridge?
We're not entirely sure, but far enough for safety measures itself.
Okay, got it.
Now, the police knew her murderer was out there. Not just out there, he or she was at the company and would be coming to work tomorrow, pretending to be distressed over Geetha's death. Passaic had 85 employees, out of which 50 were at work in person the day of Geetha's death. Security records showed that no unauthorized person had entered the plant when Geetha was killed, which could only mean one thing, that if you believe the theory that Geetha was killed, like the police and her family do, one of those 49 was a cold-blooded murderer. And to catch their killer, the first thing the police did was hide the fact that Geetha had strangulation marks on her neck and refused to tell anyone the exact reasons they believed her murder wasn't premeditated, but rather a struggle that broke out near the tanks, leading to a spontaneous murder. Only the police and the killer knew these pieces of information, and the police wanted their killer to slip up in an interview to reveal details the police hadn't let the public know. But while this was a great trick, the fact of the matter was there were literally no other leads the police could have followed to catch the person behind this. The chlorine in the water tank had completely destroyed any evidence that may have been on Geetha's body. No fingerprints were found on the broken glass or the grate covering the tank. And while the facility had security measures, they did not have any CCTV cameras or a system of people punching in and out of rooms using key cards. There were no witnesses to the crime other than the killer. There was nobody Geetha had any specific animosity or hatred with. There was just nothing. All the police knew was that Geetha had excelled at Passaic for 13 years and had risen in the ranks in an industry that was firstly primarily male and at a company that was primarily white. She was an Indian woman who wore her bindi with pride to work and had been recently promoted just a few weeks ago. There were bound to be people at the workplace who, for sexist and racist reasons, did not like Geetha's rise. In fact, just a couple of days before Geetha was found dead, she had had a stern conversation with some Passaic employees who had conducted a water check the wrong way. This was all the police had in the form of a motive, the average office dynamic where there were bound to be people who didn't like her. In their interviews with the employees, the police just needed to find out who those people were. Who were the people that seemed to fit into the police's theory that Geetha went down to the water tanks with someone whom she ended up getting in an argument and violent struggle with, in the middle of which she was strangled and pushed into the water tank. And from hours of interrogation with the 49 people who had come to work that day, the police learned a few crucial things. Firstly, upon giving all 49 employees an oral swab for a DNA test, the police collected information that may help catch the killer if DNA was somehow discovered from the crime scene later. Because, as I mentioned, there was none right now. Or maybe the police were just trying to see if anyone says no to taking the DNA test. The second thing the police learned, though, was that out of those 49 employees, there were 8 men to be specific, whose stories the police were having a hard time believing. These are men whose names we don't know, but who landed on the police's radar because firstly, it would have required considerable strength to easily and without much struggle shove the 5 feet 5 inch 80 kgs or 175 pound Geetha into a water tank. But secondly, the police honed in on these 8 men because either their stories for where they were when Geetha was in the area of the tanks wasn't super clear, or men who appear to have been in some office competition or conflict with Geetha. One of these 8 men is also the same man who told Geetha she needed to go down to the tanks and calibrate them, the man she was talking to in the break room right before she vanished and wasn't seen again. He's also the same man who was the first one to go down to the tanks after Geetha did not show up and spotted the broken glass and fallen screws and open tank that night. From these interviews, the investigators end up drawing a profile of their suspected killer, a male employee of the plant who acted alone and would exude confidence, someone who did harbor hateful feelings towards Geetha but did not plan to kill her until the argument that most likely broke out in the vicinity of the tanks. And using this profile, they narrowed down their group of 8 men to a small group of 3. Yet again, we don't know the names or identities of these 3 or even why they caught the police's attention out of the group, but we know that the man who asked Geetha to go down to the tanks and who found the broken glass first was also in this group of 3. The police eventually asked these 3 to take a polygraph test, and 2 agree, while 1 refuses. Of the 2 that agreed, 1 comes out clear, while the other's polygraph read is inconclusive. In the days that the police take to interview 49 people and then grill these 8 men and then grill the 3, work at the plant needs to go on as usual and people need to start coming to work. Security across the facility was upped, including the distribution of key cards and the setting up of a necessary 10-foot high fence in the more dangerous parts of the plant and setting up of CCTV cameras and more. The county officials came forward to establish a mandate that no visitors would be allowed to enter Passaic while the investigation was ongoing.
Ash, it must be so weird to be one of those 49 employees, right? Knowing that there is a very high likelihood that one of their co-workers is a murderer.
And we're getting to that. Yep.
Talk about a toxic work environment. Imagine the I'm sure those people would know who that group of 8 was and that group of 3 and who said no to the polygraph, which is in and of itself like very weird. It's almost when somebody pleads the 5th, you know why they're pleading the 5th.
Yep. And we're getting to that dynamic. It's going to be so weird.
Okay.
But regardless of all of these security measures that were too little and came too late, the team spirit the employees of Passaic once felt, they don't feel anymore. Because like Aryaan said, among them is a murderer. For a team as small as 49 people on any given day, all employees are most likely coming in contact with the murderer or sharing lunch with the murderer, and that just puts everyone on edge. To assuage some of these fears, the administration at Passaic comes up with an idea that they used to implement at the facility a while ago, a buddy system, with every person being paired with someone else for the times when one is going to remote parts of the facility alone or feels scared on parts of the property. Basically, the admin was assigning a friend to each employee, making sure people felt safe. You see, back in 1993, while Geetha was a young employee at Passaic, random things started going wrong at the facility, like the chlorine levels in the water being 15 times higher than the normal amount. In a different instance, shortly after, large quantities of bleach were released into the water tanks, and shortly after that, propane was released too. After one of these incidents, the grate on top of the tank that had been contaminated was found slightly open, just like it had been the day Geetha was found dead. At the time in 1993, nobody got caught for this, and so obviously there was no definitive way of knowing whether the person trying to contaminate the water supply that went to 800,000 homes back then was the same person that killed Geetha now.
So Geetha died in 2005, which means that 12 years ago is when this weird incident took place where chlorine levels and propane levels were found in the water. Of the group of 49 employees that worked on site, that was whittled down to 8, then whittled down to 3, did the police corroborate evidence of who still worked in 1993 and maybe was the suspect?
That's interesting. Geetha was one of them, from what we know.
Okay.
But we don't know whether or not they actually made this connection between the other employees. And the thing is, the police has kept the investigation really hush-hush. And why that is, you'll see in a little bit.
Yeah.
But there's very little they've revealed. Like you see, we don't know the names of any of
So,
these
but I'm sure
people.
in order to come to those 3 people,
sure
that
they
was a
were.
factor
Right.
who still worked in 1993
If their
perhaps.
investigators were their salt, they obviously
Yeah,
should
yeah,
have
yeah.
done that. In fact, like I just said, we don't even know if that person is still working at the plant in 2005 or if they quit at some point in between. But the idea of a rogue and ill-intentioned employee, a criminal hiding in the herd, is the same years apart. It is key to note, however, when the water was tested from the tank where Geetha's body was found, it showed no other signs of contamination and all chemical levels came out to normal. Because the police were unable to determine any tangible links between these two sets of incidents, the police too reached the conclusion that this most likely was a coincidence. While the police are probing for theories, Geetha's family cremates her body in New Jersey in accordance with Hindu custom. The devastating blow to the family from the loss of Geetha left a void that no amount of time was going to fill. But while there was no way of bringing her back, the next best thing the family could do was to fight for justice. And fight they did. They began to set forth their own theory. They believed the murderer did not act alone. They even came forward to point out all the many reasons such an incident occurred at Passaic. You see, the plant had 55 violations of varying security codes back in 2001, which were eventually rectified, but Geetha's death exposed so many other loopholes. For example, the tank in which Geetha fell had industrial-grade sensors attached to it to alert the workers if anything fell inside and possibly compromise the quality of the water. But for whatever weird reason, the sensors did not go off even with the falling of an adult woman's body. And her family were livid about this detail. In their minds, since Geetha had died from drowning, there would have been time to possibly save her had the sensors gone off. The family also raised concerns about all of the other things we've mentioned so far: CCTV cameras, the buddy system that was removed shortly before Geetha had died, the key cards, etc. While criticizing Passaic, the family also began to beg and plead the larger federal investigators to join this case because it was starting to get pretty clear after the interviews of the 49 employees and the dwindling of those to 3 suspects. The current investigators literally had zero headway. The case had reached a screeching halt with nowhere for the police to go. No DNA, no witness, no circumstantial evidence, no established motive. It was beginning to seem like the perfect crime. Regardless of the family's cries for help though, nothing really came of their requests because right when all of this is happening in Geetha's case, a different case from New Jersey had captured the national imagination with a ton of resources diverted to it. The Melanie Maguire case, infamously known as the suitcase murder, where the 32-year-old nurse had shot and killed her husband only to dismember his body and stuff it in 3 different suitcases. And so, contrary to Geetha's case getting more attention than before, it began to get less. 4 months after her death, the county prosecutor James Vigliano said, quote, "We're right where we were, which is nowhere." If anything, forget about getting more senior investigators. Something weird begins to happen with the investigators who were working on the case so far. They begin to say that they now believe Geetha's death was a suicide. So what happened was the investigators ended up getting a new medical examiner to have a look at Geetha's autopsy. And this examiner went on to say that the kind of bruising found on Geetha's neck, the very bruising that made this a clear murder, can actually happen during cold water drownings. One of the people to sort of semi-confirm this theory is Derek Pounder, a Scottish forensic psychologist from the University of Dundee, who's actually an expert in the field of drownings. The investigators then got 4 other MEs to look at the autopsy again, some of whom did agree that there were known cases of people receiving similar bruises from cold water drownings due to hemorrhaging of the neckline from the pressure of falling into cold water. But they all agreed that while such bruising may be common in some drowning cases, Geetha's bruises seem more likely to be a cause of strangulation. The problem with the police's theory was that by the time these people are giving these new opinions on her autopsy, Geetha's body has been cremated. So none of these people have actually seen it. The only person to have actually studied her body had ruled this to be a clear homicide, and that was the only opinion that logically carried most weight. Regardless though, this narrative slowly gained traction among the police department back then, with the police believing that Geetha walked over to the tanks and was distracted with her beaker and her clipboard and either jumped voluntarily or accidentally slipped in and died.
Just trying to understand the mechanics of the accidental falling or the suicide.
Mm-hmm.
That the grates had to be manually opened, right? The metal grates. So yeah, which is why an accidental, death doesn't necessarily make sense to me unless she was checking something which required her to move the
Which
accidental.
she did have to.
Which
she
did
had
have
to get
to.
water samples, yeah.
Then nobody, this modus operandi of killing yourself just doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah.
An accidental cause still, I don't, is still worth considering.
Makes more sense.
But I had no idea that if you fall in cold water, you have marks like that.
The more you know. This theory of the police also states that there's a possibility that someone else had left the tank open by mistake and came back to close it after they realized their mistake has caused a death. But that's not the same as murder, of course. To Geetha's family, all of these developments came as a huge disappointment. Months passed and then years while the family waited, receiving no movement at all. Which is when, in 2007, 2 years after Geetha's murder, her family filed a lawsuit against the Water Commission for their negligence in terms of security and safety measures. But most surprisingly and most eerily, the family said that an episode of Law & Order SVU called Brotherhood, filmed at the plant shortly before Geetha's death and aired in January of 2004, was the one to inspire Geetha's murder. You see, in this episode, in a hazing incident gone wrong, a frat brother ends up getting pushed into a tank of chlorinated water. The whole catch of the episode is that chlorine helps destroy all signs of DNA evidence in the aftermath of a crime. And the family claim this is simply too huge a coincidence. The facility is used as a shooting location for an episode showing a death by drowning in a chlorine tank. And a year after the episode airs, Geetha dies at the same plant in the same way. The family claims that's just not a coincidence. They claim that is proof. Geetha was murdered. Despite the family's zeal towards their theories though, law enforcement does not buy them and Geetha's case gets frozen in time. Death anniversary after death anniversary passes with the family remembering their wife and mother, trying their best to honor her. Described by them as highly efficient, energetic, composed and a clear thinker, Geetha was academically talented with a flair for numbers. Since childhood, Geetha was very well organized and strict with timelines. We sometimes find it hard to catch up with her expectations, they said. Quote, a dedicated wife, loving and caring mom, she was everything for her family. She was the center of our world, said her children in her memory. Quote, a beautiful person who will be remembered for her infinite energy, infectious smile and engaging personality, read her obituary. This beautiful person, the center of the Angara family's world, was no more, and the family seemed to be as far from closure as they did from Geetha. 19 years have passed to the day Geetha drowned and died, and we seem to be just as far away from answers today as we were back then. In 2015, the Passaic County Prosecutor's Office came forward to say that those 3 men the police had narrowed down as suspects from the 49 employees were no longer under the radar and were no longer considered suspects. And unfortunately, this is one of those cases where this is how we end. with no answers for you all. But we want to hear from you this time. Tell us in the comments, what do you think happened on February the 9th, 2005? Is there a murderer out there who roams free? Or just a tragic accident that got misinterpreted and mistakenly turned into one of New Jersey's most puzzling mysteries? If you like what we do here at Desi Studios and absolutely love what we're wearing today, this is merch you can go buy all for yourself.
You can buy this Desi Crime merch in our YouTube store on the link down below at Karak Merch. Keep the engines at Desi Studios rolling so we can pay our videographer right behind the camera to make these amazing episodes just for you.